Guadalupe Medina Pichardo was born on January 16, 2013, in the municipality of Nezahualcóyotl in the eastern region of the Mexican state of Mexico. She was the youngest daughter of her mother, a woman named Yedira Medina, and her mother's partner with whom she had a long-term relationship. Although the name of Guadalupe's father was not disclosed, it is known that he and his wife had two other children named Angel and Karen. Furthermore, Yedira herself had another child that she gave birth to by an unknown man. Guadalupe's mother was reportedly born in 1999. She grew up in a modest household with her parents, whose names are not known, as well as her brothers Cesar and Brian and her sisters Eveline, Maria and Maria. Yedira's childhood was not easy. Rather, it was full of difficulties primarily related to the constant conflicts between her mother and her father, who at that time worked in a clothing factory. Yedira's mother was literally consumed by jealousy and constantly accused her husband of infidelity, leading to an unbearable living environment. In reality, Yedira's father was not only faithful to his wife, but also provided for the family's financial and emotional well-being. Unfortunately, tensions arose between the couple one day, and the man decided to leave the family. Yedira herself said she felt as if a part of her heart had broken. Soon after, the atmosphere in the family home became much tenser. Yedira's mother, frustrated by her husband's departure, began to exhibit increasing physical aggression towards the children. It is hard to say what the main reason for this was, but most often the woman's anger was directed against Yedira. One of her brothers, specifically Cesar, tried to look out for her well-being and even took on the role of a father figure in her life to some extent. However, this was not enough to diffuse the unfavorable situation. Be that as it may, Yedira soon began to display quite disturbing behavior. This behavior manifested itself primarily in her dealings with other people. A striking example was when the 7-year-old Yedira brought alcohol to school and gave it to her classmates. That, of course, had consequences. And finally, Yedira was expelled from school. At that time, she decided never to go back to school, and none of her relatives tried to persuade her otherwise. Consequently, she never learned to read or write. Since then, Yedira spent much more time at home, which further exacerbated her problems and conflicts with her mother. She even began to think about how she could end the situation. So, at the age of only 8, she ran away from home. In her childish imagination, she saw a future only with her father, and he took her in. But just 2 months later, he died from complications of diabetes. After that, Yedira was forced to return home to her mother. This time, however, she realized that if she lived with her mother, she would become a target for aggression. Therefore, she decided to spend as much time as possible outside the house. Soon, the street became a kind of refuge for Yedira. Unexpectedly, she found herself among homeless people who banded together to survive. These people gave Yedira a sense of family, but they also taught her bad things. So Yedira, despite her young age, began to break the law and consume illegal substances. At the age of 12, she was forced into sexual intercourse for the first time, not by a stranger, but by her own maternal uncle. It is not known why, but this terrible event drove her to return home. Perhaps she sought support and comfort from her relatives. When she finally returned and told her mother what had happened, her mother lost control and hit her with a hose. Such a reaction logically worsened her suffering, and she decided never to trust anyone again. Later in 2004, Yedira became pregnant for the first time, and since the child's father did not acknowledge him, Cesar, Yedira's brother, became her main support again. He taught her to be strong and to accept all the challenges life held for her. Motivated by his words and concern for the well-being of her future daughter, Yedira gave up illegal substances for a while. Soon after, her first daughter, Belen, was born. However, she was either unwilling or simply unable to take responsibility for childcare, so this task fell to her mother. Contrary to expectations, the grandmother cared for Belen lovingly and caringly. Meanwhile, Yedira herself plunged back into street life and returned to consuming illegal substances. She chose a neighborhood in Mexico City called Pantitlan as the scene of her illegal activities. It was an important transit point in the city's public transport system, always crowded and busy. Indeed, it was the perfect environment for Yedira and her petty criminal activities, on which her survival directly depended. Mostly she was a thief, but there were also rumors that she was occasionally involved in transporting contraband goods. Her mother often came to the place and tried to get Yedira to come home, but her pleas never achieved the desired result. Yedira herself had become accustomed to this way of life and considered the street the safest place to live. After some time, Yedira met a young man who, like her, suffered from an addiction. The new acquaintances then began a romantic relationship, and in 2009 they had their first child together, whom they named Angel. 2 years later, Karen was born. But as before, Yedira entrusted the care of the children to her mother, who in turn placed them in the care of a neighbor named Laura. A few years later, namely in January 2013, Guadalupe was born. Yedira didn't even go to the hospital to avoid incurring significant costs for the birth. Even before the birth, she decided to give the child up for adoption. For this reason, she did not take the necessary steps to register her daughter and did not issue any official documents for her. In other words, legally speaking, Guadalupe did not exist. In April of the same year, Yedira was arrested for trying to steal diapers from a supermarket in the city. She was subsequently sentenced to 2 years and 4 months in prison. Guadalupe, who was only a few months old at the time, was then placed in the care of her Aunt Evelyn, who was also struggling with addiction problems. Shortly afterwards, Evelyn did something unbelievable and sold her niece for only 1,000 pesos to a local garbage collector named Gonzalo. I should point out that Yedira also knew Gonzalo. She saw him sometimes walking around the street, but no one dared to tell her that her daughter was with him. Every time she called her mother from prison, she told her that Guadalupe was fine and that Evelyn had her. But in reality, her child spent her childhood with Gonzalo. He taught her how to separate plastic and recognize the markings on bottles, which they later took for recycling. In the meantime, Yedira, far from home, spent her days waiting for the rare visits of her brother Cesar. He was still the only one who believed in her, no matter what happened. The young man always encouraged her and urged her not to give up hope for a better future for herself and her children. But at some point, Cesar stopped coming. A few days later, Yedira received the news that he was no longer there. It turned out that someone had tried to rob Cesar, but he had defended himself and finally disappeared. This news was a real tragedy for Yedira. She couldn't come to her senses for a long time. When she was free again, she wished for nothing more than to see Guadalupe. As soon as Yedira found out where her daughter really was, she immediately set out to find Gonzalo and took her daughter away from him. Marina, one of her sisters, recognized that Yedira had no means to support herself and care for Guadalupe. She therefore offered Yedira to stay with her temporarily, at least until the situation stabilized. Yedira gladly accepted her sister's offer. She was now determined to take her life into her own hands and care properly for her daughter. After living with her sister for a while, Yedira moved with her daughter into a rented room in the house of the aforementioned neighbor named Laura. I would like to remind you that Laura also cared for Yedira's other children, namely Angel and Karen. To make ends meet and pay the rent, she took a job as a vendor at a vegetable stand at the local market. It seemed as if her life was finally taking a turn for the better, but soon everything changed. This happened after Yedira visited her brother's grave in the cemetery. There she remembered that Cesar had always been there for her and supported her. He certainly belonged to those she truly loved, regardless of her inadequacies and lifestyle. The visit to the cemetery, however, was a severe test for her, and soon she returned to her old habits, namely the consumption of alcohol and illegal substances. In the process, she completely forgot about her daughter Guadalupe. Soon after, Yedira met a young man named Pablo Rodriguez Escamilla. Little is known about him. According to some reports, he was born in 1990 in Mexico City. Like Yedira, he also had a bad relationship with his mother. Furthermore, Pablo had many problems with the law. Mostly the young man was charged for consumption and possession of illegal substances. In total, he spent about a year in prison. After his release, he returned to his activities, combining the sale of illegal substances with robbing passers-by. When he met Yedira, Pablo himself had stopped consuming illegal substances, but he still had an immediate craving for alcohol. Shortly after meeting her, he even invited her for a few beers in a bar. In a surprisingly courteous manner, he was accommodating and even paid the bill. So a romantic relationship began between Yedira and Pablo. Subsequently, they even began to live together, albeit on the street. After a few months of living with her new partner, Yedira went to Laura to discuss Guadalupe's future fate. First, she said that she could keep her daughter if Laura gave her a sum of 1,000 pesos. Although Laura loved the little girl and wanted to keep her, she couldn't raise the amount named by Yedira. Finally, Yedira took her daughter with her. But this time, too, they didn't live together long. Already in December 2016, Yedira decided to place her daughter in the care of a stranger's family. But after only 2 months, Yedira regretted her actions and took Guadalupe back. At that time, her life situation was even more difficult. She had no steady income, and her dependence on illegal substances was getting worse. Furthermore, her alcoholic partner was no help at all. All this caused some concern to Yedira's relatives and other people around her. It is known that some of them even offered Yedira their help, but she repeatedly refused, even though she herself practically paid no attention to the child. Moreover, Pablo began to abuse Guadalupe more and more frequently. When her mother and little sister visited one day, it became known that Pablo had beaten her again. Soon her grandmother became aware of the mistreatment of Guadalupe. She then filed a complaint with the state organization responsible for monitoring children's welfare, but she never received a response. In mid-March 2017, Guadalupe accidentally wet the makeshift bed while sleeping. When Yedira realized what had happened, she flew into a rage. Pablo, who also noticed the incident, gave the child a few hard slaps. But that wasn't enough for the young man. He then continued his abuse. Yedira always remained indifferent in such moments. Her daughter's suffering didn't interest her. It was the same this time. And when Guadalupe fell to the floor again and hit her head hard, it was clear she was dead. But even this tragic event didn't embarrass Yedira. She and Pablo simply wrapped the child's body in a blanket and then carelessly threw it away in the neighboring colony. The next morning, a passerby noticed the blanket. Out of curiosity, he came closer to examine it more closely. Then he noticed that an object was wrapped inside the blanket. Finally, he gathered his courage, unwrapped the blanket, and discovered the lifeless body of Guadalupe. The girl was wearing a green coat and a purple t-shirt with a fairy pattern. The man estimated that the deceased was no older than 4 years old. When the shock subsided, he immediately called the police. Paramedics and police officers arrived soon after and confirmed that the girl was dead. According to initial assessments, the main cause of death was a head injury. The child's body was later taken to the local forensic medicine service office. Simultaneously, the authorities initiated an official investigation. Meanwhile, Yedira and Pablo returned home, disposed of their clothing, and cleaned up the crime scene. Shortly afterwards, she intentionally injured her face and prepared a speech to give herself an alibi in case anyone asked about her daughter's whereabouts. She intended to claim that Guadalupe's biological father had attacked her and kidnapped the girl. However, when Marina asked about her niece, she told her a completely different story. Some time later, the police officers received the final autopsy results. In addition to the obvious head trauma already identified by the emergency services at the site where the body was found, the report also pointed to another possible cause of death. There could have been bleeding in the area of the pancreas, liver, and kidneys. Furthermore, the forensic examiners determined that the girl was between 4 and 5 years old and about 10 cm shorter than the average for children of that age. Undoubtedly, all this information was more than dramatic, as it indicated not only abuse, but also that the child had not been properly nourished or cared for over a long period. Much worse, however, was the fact that when trying to establish the girl's identity, it turned out that no records about her had been kept. In other words, neither her fingerprints nor her DNA samples matched any data available in the law enforcement system. Even more surprising was the fact that no one had reported the girl missing. No one seemed interested in the child's fate. Months passed. During this time, all available information about the child was repeatedly mentioned in the media, but the authorities were unable to find the perpetrators of her death or her relatives. Meanwhile, Yedira and Pablo returned to their usual lives without the slightest remorse, continuing to consume illegal substances and alcohol. But in contrast to the shockingly unmoved mother, there was someone who was genuinely interested in the case, a nationally known activist from the state of Jalisco named Veronica Bellabasu. She was generally a human rights lawyer specializing in investigating crimes against women and children. Convinced that the authorities' efforts were ineffective, Veronica Basu took the matter into her own hands and launched a major campaign to find the deceased girl's relatives. Soon after, she circulated a picture of the child on social media. Later, a forensic examiner named Rosa Alejandra joined the campaign. She created a new portrait of Guadalupe, which was subsequently shown regularly on news programs. As a result, many people called Veronica to tell her they believed they knew the victim. However, none of these leads ever led to the truth. Finally, at the end of November 2017, Marina, Yedira's sister, saw a picture of the child still being shown on television. She immediately thought this little girl looked like her missing niece Guadalupe. Determined to find out her whereabouts, Marina contacted Veronica and told her about Guadalupe. Soon after, the activist visited her and showed her a photo taken by police officers when the body was found. Although Marina hadn't seen her niece for some time, she could say with certainty that it was Guadalupe. On December 24, 2017, the Attorney General's Office of the State of Mexico arrested Yedira and Pablo as the prime suspects in the crime. Simultaneously, preventive measures were imposed against them, and both were placed in pretrial detention. At the same time, experts compared Yedira's DNA samples with those of the girl and finally confirmed their relationship. Surprisingly, the suspects confessed to their deeds during the first hearing. While awaiting their trial, they were taken to a social reintegration center in the municipality of Nezahualcóyotl. The trial in this case, however, did not take place until early September 2019. Judge Cesar Menchaca immediately stated that he had no doubt that the defendants had committed this heinous crime. After presenting all the evidence, he found Guadalupe Medina Pichardo and Pablo Rodriguez Escamilla guilty of the murder of little Guadalupe. Through the verdict, both criminals were sentenced to 88 years in prison. In addition, the convicts were sentenced to a fine equivalent to more than $30,000. Obviously, they did not have this money. Nevertheless, they must repay it by working several hours a day throughout their imprisonment. The government lawyers assigned to the offenders immediately stated that they would apply for a sentence reduction. Marina, Yedira's sister, has asked the court for protection for her entire family. She was seriously concerned that Pablo's relatives might try to harm them. Thanks to the tireless efforts and commitment of some people, the Guadalupe case is exemplary, at least in terms of the pursuit of justice. Thanks for watching and take care of yourself.